Well, today we are continuing a series of worship services that are exploring the parables of Jesus. And at the heart of our series is a book that's written by Professor Amy Jill Levine, and it is called Short Stories of Jesus, the Enigmatic Parables of a Controversial Rabbi. We're also using this book and a wonderful video series that Amy Jill put together for this book during our Wednesday evening and our Sunday morning online classes. And I want to encourage you, if you haven't ever joined us for one of those, come and experience it. This is a really great conversation. She's a great communicator, brilliant thinker. She's going to challenge you. And she's challenged me. I don't agree with everything she says, and I'm sure you're not going to agree with everything she says. But she's really put together a very thought-provoking, very insightful, and I think has reshaped the way I'm seeing some very familiar parables. And my expectation is that you might experience that same thing as we journey together through this. Well, today we're going to be looking at one of the most familiar parables in the Gospels. And it begins with a lawyer who decides that he's going to try to test Jesus. And really, that's just language saying he's going to try to trap Jesus. And so he approaches Jesus and asks him, "Teacher, what must I do to have eternal life?" And Jesus replies to him with another question. Well, what is written in the law? What do you read there? And of course, the lawyer knew the law well, and he actually takes two different passages, one from Deuteronomy and one from Leviticus, and kind of combines them into something that we now know as the Great Commandment. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and your neighbor as yourself. Upon hearing that answer, Jesus said to the lawyer, "You're right, that's correct. Do that, and you will live." But the lawyer wasn't done with Jesus just yet. Now the lawyer wants to justify himself. He wants to justify his own faith. And so he asks Jesus, "Okay then, if that's the great commandment, then who is my neighbor?" Now, it's at this point in the story where Amy Jill Levine says something really insightful about that question. That question really isn't just about who is my neighbor. Actually, asking the question, who is my neighbor, is a polite way of asking who isn't my neighbor. See, the lawyer wants to know who it is that he doesn't have to love, who it is that he doesn't have to care for, who it is that he doesn't have to pay attention to. His language says, "Who is my neighbor?" but his motives seem to be saying, "Who isn't my neighbor?" And it's a pretty good loophole, because if the law says you've got to love your neighbor as yourself, if someone isn't your neighbor, then you're off the hook. And so what's happening here is the lawyer isn't just asking the surface question. He's asking something a little bit deeper. And Jesus knows this. And so Jesus responds by telling him a parable. And the parable begins with the explanation that there is a man who is walking down the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he falls into the hands of robbers who beat him, take everything he has, and leave him half dead by the side of the road. Now, it just happened that there was a priest who was walking down that same road and saw the man lying there. The priest, seeing the man, crossed to the other side of the road and walked by. A Levite came, another religious leader, both priests and Levites, well respected in the Jewish community. A Levite came by, and he did the exact same thing the priest did. Saw the man in need lying there, but went to the other side of the road and crossed the road and did not respond to the man in any way, at least that we know about. Now, there's a couple things we need to pay attention to at this point in the story. The first thing is that we get no descriptor of the man. We don't know his race, his ethnicity. We don't know his age. We don't know his station in life. We don't know anything about him. And I think that that's probably intentional because this person that's in the ditch, this person that's been beaten, it could be anybody. It could be me. It could be you. The purpose here is to make sure that there is no reason based on that individual why anyone would walk by. There's no excuses here. The second thing that we note here, and this is really interesting, this is the first part of this parable where Amy Jill Levine actually corrects something that I've always thought was true about this parable. I've preached it in this room more than once. And the reasoning that the thing that I've preached is a reason why the priest and the Levite may have crossed the road and gone by. And the reason goes like this. These are religious leaders, and if they are on their way to perform duties in the temple, if they're on their way to do something that is dependent upon their religious office, they've got to remain pure. If in any way they defile themselves, they can't carry out their religious responsibility. And if they are to touch a half-dead person in the road, there are some specific laws about that would make them impure. Even if the person is dead, it would make them impure. This is a place where they could be, with the way that I've explained it, and some people have explained it to me. This is maybe a time when the priest and the Levite were, well, if you give them the benefit of the doubt, maybe trying to answer a higher call and maybe trying to do the very best they could in a difficult situation to live into a moment where they were really trying not to do anything wrong, but in fact end up doing something wrong. Well, here's what Professor Levine points out that's just so important for us to pay attention to. And honestly, I think it's something I've always known. But as a religious leader who is looking for some sympathy for other religious leaders, I think I've just conveniently forgotten it. The issue is this, that there are some specific laws about purity, and these laws are important. But there are also laws in the Torah and in Scripture that make it very clear that you are called to care for anyone who is wounded or injured, and even if you find someone who is dead, there are particular laws that demand that you take care and treat that body with respect. So there's competing laws here. There's laws of purity, and there's laws of compassion and dignity. And so you've got to choose which law. Now, according to the way Jesus talks about the greatest commandment in Matthew and Mark, the answer to this question, the answer to which way we're supposed to choose, it's very clear. Everything falls under the two laws of loving God and loving your neighbor. Everything comes after that. If you are faced with a situation where you have to choose, you always choose loving God, loving neighbor, and then those other laws come after that. Any other law and prophecy hangs on those two rules, period. There is no justification. There's no justification for the priest and the Levite to choose ritual purity laws over laws of compassion, justice, and kindness. You cannot do that. And by the way, let's say they were to do something that would cause them to be unclean. Well, there are purification rites. And those purification rites restore them to the state of cleanliness that they would need to have in order to perform their religious rites. Now, they wouldn't be able to do it that day. It takes some time. But that's what those purification rites were all about. Was to, if you were to be defiled for any reason, you use those rights and you come back. See, again, there's just no excuse. We may want to justify why they crossed the road, but there is no justification for them crossing the road. Here's the reality of what they represent. They represent you and I when we are confronted with the choice of doing the right thing or not doing the right thing. And we choose, for whatever reason, even if we've got it justified, we choose to walk on by. Now, there is another interesting insight into this parable. This one comes from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who has this quote in one of his most famous sermons, and I want to share that with you now. He preached, this is on the night before he was assassinated, he preached these words. I'm going to tell you what my imagination tells me. It's possible these men were afraid. And so the first question that the priest and the Levite asked was, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? But then the Good Samaritan came by and he reversed the question. If I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? You see that the fundamental reversal of that question is key to how we respond to what's happening in this passage, what's going on with the priest and the Levite. They may have been afraid. Their first question may have been, what happens to me? Now, in this sermon, Martin Luther King Jr., he is in Memphis the night before he's assassinated, and he's there to care for, to walk alongside the sanitation workers who are striking for causes of justice and for better treatment. And he is there, and he knows there's risks. He knows about the risks in being there. But in facing those risks, he has a choice. Does he walk on by in ways that could protect him, or does he go in ways that may place him at risk but helps them? And he flips the question around. He says, what happens if I don't? Oh, it's such a powerful, powerful moment. You see, at the core of our faith, this is at the core of our faith. When we have a choice to make about helping someone else, even if it causes potential risk or sacrifice on our own, the fundamental choice of Christianity is to choose to serve the sake of the other. Yes, there are some individual blessings that go along with being Christian. There's no doubt about that. But at the core of our faith is the call to put the need of the other, particularly the need of the least of these, those who are hurting and those who are desperate, those who really need our help. We are called to put their needs ahead of ours. There is no way to argue around that in the Christian faith. And if we choose what's in our own best interest, if we're faced with a situation where our decision and our action or lack thereof could cause harm or hurt or injury to someone else, if we don't choose what is compassionate and loving in that moment, well, we're just simply no longer walking in the path of Jesus. We're walking instead in the path of the priest and the Levite. But a good Samaritan came along. A Samaritan came along. And he saw the man lying there by the side of the road, and he went and he bandaged him. He cared for him. He put him on his own animal and took him to an inn. And when he got to the inn, he continued to care for him. And then the next day, he gave some money to the innkeeper and said, use this money to do whatever you need to do to take care of him. And if what you need to do to take care of him costs more than what I've given you, I will come back and I will repay you every penny of what you need to restore his health. After telling this story, Jesus turns to the lawyer and he says, okay, out of all the people who were there in this story, which one was the neighbor to the man in the ditch? Now, this is a really interesting moment because the lawyer knows what the answer is. I mean, the answer is the Samaritan, right? We know that. But the Jewish people hated the Samaritans. And you know this. You've probably heard this before. I mean, there is no love lost between the Israelites and the Samaritan people. They could not stand each other. In fact, in the chapter just before the one where this parable is told, we're told a story about Jesus coming to a Samaritan village, and they refused to welcome him, which is just extremely offensive. They just refused to welcome him. And the disciples of Jesus are so mad, they said, do you want us to command, two disciples asked Jesus, do you want us to command that fire comes down from heaven and destroys them all? Jesus rebukes them, of course, and says, of course not. But that's the kind of tension. I mean, these people just cannot stand each other. They can't. And the fact that Jesus is telling a story where a Samaritan is the model of faith, not a priest and a Levite, this would not just have shocked people, it would have angered them. It would have angered them. And so in this moment, Jesus turns to the lawyer and he says, which one of these three is the neighbor to the man in the ditch? And the lawyer hates Samaritans so much that he can't even bring himself to utter that word. He won't even say it. He won't even say the Samaritan. I imagine that through clenched teeth, he says, the one who showed mercy. He didn't want to say it. But there was no other answer. And so Jesus looks at him, and Jesus got him right where he wants him, right? And so Jesus says to him, all right, You're correct. Go and do likewise. So in this moment, Jesus is telling the lawyer that if he wants to have life, he has to go and follow the model of his enemy and to be like him. Oh, it had to hurt. It had to hurt. In her book, Professor Levine talks about how we're called to interpret parables. And one of the things she says is this: our reaction to them, to parables, should be one of resistance rather than acceptance. If we hear a parable and think, I really like that, or worse, fail to take any challenge, we are not listening well enough. If that statement is true, that if we want to understand what we're to learn from this parable of the Samaritan, we've got to explore where it is in this parable that we are challenged. What is challenging us in this parable? And while it may be different for you than it is for me, I'm going to let you know what challenges me in this parable. The first thing that challenges me is the behavior of the priest and the Levite. As a religious leader like them, I have given my life to serve God and the community of faith. I know what that role requires, and they did as well. And yet there have been too many times, far too many times than I would care to admit, where I have not done the thing that I knew I needed to do. Where when I was confronted or faced with a decision or an action that I knew I needed to take, that God was calling me to take, I asked the question, well, if I do that, what happens to me? There's been far too many times when I've seen a need or known what the appropriate thing to do was, and I found a way to justify not doing it. And this parable challenges me on that. Jesus challenges me in this parable when he points out and calls out the hatred between these two groups, the Samaritans and the Israelites. It challenges me the way he addresses the tension between the two of them and lifts up the enemy as the one we are to model, and lifts up the one within the own tribe, their own tribe, as the ones we need to correct and call out. I'm challenged by that. And one of the places where I'm most specifically challenged by that is in the experience of our modern society right now. We are so torn apart in so many ways. Where we see people being on the other side, if they disagree with us, if they worship differently than us, if they vote differently than us, if they experience or have different family structures than, whatever the case may be, we find all kinds of reasons to make people different than us. And if they're different than us, then they're not on our team, and we struggle with that. There may be some of us who even wonder, like I'm sure the Israelites wondered then, whether or not there could ever be a good Samaritan. We wonder, can there be a good Democrat? Can there be a good Republican? Can there be a good Muslim? And the list goes on and on and on, and we wonder, and if we were to hear a person from some of these categories that we don't affiliate with and maybe don't like, and maybe if we're honest, even feel some hatred and animosity toward, if we see them doing something good, can we even accept it? You know, I wonder sometimes if we don't just fall into the temptation to justify the priests and Levites in our own tribes, to justify the wrongdoing of people who we know aren't doing the right thing, particularly when it comes to faith, but we justify it because they're part of our group. We justify the priests and Levites among us. But then when it comes to the Samaritans and those who are on the other team who are doing something good, can we even admit that they've done something good, or do we have to do it through clenched teeth? Do we have to admit that they've actually done something good, but only reluctantly? I'm challenged by that. Because you see, the call of Christ is to recognize, right? To recognize the good in others and to call out the failures in ourselves. I'm challenged by the generosity of the Samaritan. He's willing to give everything he has, time, energy, money, for the sake of a stranger to make sure that person's okay. How do we respond to calls for generosity like that? Do we hold on tight to our time, to our energy, to our financial resources, because we're afraid that if we let go of them too loosely, what's going to happen to us? That maybe if we're the person on the side of the road, no one's going to take care of us and we don't have our own resources. I'm challenged by the generosity of the Samaritan because he calls me to a greater generosity. And the last thing in this parable that challenges me is one that is a challenge that we often overlook. Remember the first question, the thing that leads us into this whole thing. Who is my neighbor? And in response to who is my neighbor, Jesus tells this story, and at the end of it asks the question, who is the neighbor of the man who was lying in the ditch? And of course, the lawyer says the one who showed mercy, and we know that to be the Samaritan, even though we wouldn't utter that word. And so we know who the neighbor is. And while the answer is about who's the neighbor to the man in the ditch, the man by the side of the road, we know there's more to it than that. Because if the Samaritan is that man's neighbor, the Samaritan is also the lawyer's neighbor. The question that the man asks, who is my neighbor? Remember, he's trying to figure out who isn't his neighbor, so he's got an out. The way that Jesus answers that question is fundamentally this way. Everyone's your neighbor. There isn't a person who isn't your neighbor. They are all your neighbor. They are my neighbor. Everyone. And if ever we walk by the needs of a neighbor and we do not express love and compassion and mercy, even if it impacts us personally in a way that we may not like, even if it calls us to stretch ourselves, even risk ourselves, if we can't live into that and we don't live into that, then this parable is one we need to remember because it's speaking to us. Because our temptation, just like the lawyer, is we want to justify everything that we do that falls short. And everything about this parable says there is no justification for not loving your neighbor and caring for them in a time of need, no matter who they are. Now, in typical and frustrating fashion, Jesus doesn't tell us what the lawyer does after this. We have no idea how this story ends. It just ends. But while we don't know how his story ends, we have a choice in how our story ends. After hearing this parable, we have a choice. Which path will we follow? My hope and prayer is that we will choose wisely.